the table saw today. Primary purpose of the table saw is for ripping, making rip cuts. So here's the base. This is a 10-inch table saw. The size of the table saw is determined by the diameter of the blade. Most saws in the shop are determined by the diameter of the blade, is how you determine the size of it. So this one is a 10-inch table saw. Once again, determined by the diameter of the blade. This wheel right here, this handle, raises and lowers the blade. Clockwise raises it, counterclockwise lowers the blade. This handle right here angles the blade. So if you need to cut a miter or a beveled cut on your board, you would rotate this wheel right here. Every time I walk up to the saw, the first thing I do is I make sure this is pulled all the way back towards me. Make sure the blade's at a 90-degree angle if I'm making a basic rip cut. This is the guide bar. That is what the fence slides on. This is the fence. This is the fence lockdown handle or knob. I don't know if you noticed that or not. You do not need to bear down on this. You just need to push it down firmly and check to make sure it stays in place. There is a scale along the fence, which is how you are going to set the size in which you're going to cut your piece or rip your piece to. If we look here, there are two different measurements. The location the fence is in currently, you're going to use this furthest diamond. The fence is sitting vertical at this point with the highest brace of the fence. We can drop that aspect down by loosening these two T-nuts. Rotating the fence over, sliding it back into position. We have the fence in this position. We are now measuring from this diamond. I will move it over to 4 inches. So once again, first diamond, fence laying on its side, vertical position, the furthest diamond away. This is our table for the table saw. Obviously our blade, miter gauge slots. There are two miter gauge slots within the table. The miter gauge slot work in relationship or conjunction with the miter gauge. So this is if you were going to perform a cross-cutting operation on the table saw. You would use the miter gauge in the miter gauge slot. So again, you can loosen this and adjust it to various angles. If you're just making a 90-degree cross cut, you're going to set it to 90 degrees and make a cross cut. This is the blade guard. Proper protocol for setting up our saw. First thing we're going to do when we walk up to it is we're going to make sure, once again, the angle knot handle is pulled all the way back to us. We're going to set our stock next to the blade, and we want the blade to be 1/8 of an inch above the stock, or I tell everyone a blade tooth. Once we have done that, we're going to pull our blade guard over. I want as much room between the blade guard and the fence as possible so that I can fit my hand or my push stick between there. Then I'm going to make sure as I slide my board under here, only the board can fit. My finger cannot fit underneath there. If your finger is coming in contact with the blade guard, you are inside the safety margin. The safety margin on the table saw is 4 inches, and we should be outside that 4-inch safety margin at all times. If your board is 6 inches in width or narrower, you need to be utilizing a push stick. The safety margin is 4 inches. So once again, I've got this all set up. Now I'm going to rip this board to 4 inches. I'm going to slide my fence over. Once again, lining up the first diamond with the measurement that I want to cut to. Since my fence is in this location, I'm going to firmly press down the fence lock knob or handle. I'm going to check it. As you can see here, the edge of my board has been jointed. I cannot use the the table saw without a working edge, which is referred to as the jointed edge, is the working edge. If I am working with a short piece, I set my board down just like this with my jointed edge facing the ceiling. If I'm working with a longer piece, I have my jointed edge facing the direction of the fence, but set over here to the side. Now at this point I can turn on the saw. It is not going to hurt anything just sitting here running, so I could get myself in position. So if I was going to cut, I would turn the saw on, get myself in position, which is placing my left leg against the guide bar, never standing directly in line with the blade. The saw would be running at this point. Once again, it's causing no harm. My left hand would be pushing the board up against the fence. My right hand would be feeding it in. And then at the proper time, I would grab my push stick, angling my push stick slightly towards the fence to prevent the board or stock from leaking off the fence. Two things that causes kickbacks. One is the board leaking off the fence, causing a binding action, which will cause a kickback. If a kickback happened in that situation and you're standing in the proper stance, the kickback is going to come back and miss you. That is why we are standing with our left leg against the guide bar. Other reason for a kickback is not having good downward pressure on the board, and the board is going to raise up on the blade. Generally when this happens, it creates a binding mechanism and the board swings around. That'll either get caught on the blade guide or it could swing around. Once again, if we're standing in this position, it should not be a safety issue. Once again, as I'm making this cut, the blade would be on and running. I have my board up against the fence, my push stick angled so that I'm keeping it against the fence. I'm making sure I'm staying at least 4 inches away from the blade, not getting close to the blade guard. As I am cutting, once I exit the opposite side of the blade, I'm going to make sure I finish the cut and the board is not left in between the blade and the fence. We want to make sure we finish that cut. If for some reason there's a little piece of scrap left next to the blade, you can hear it, you can see it, we're going to shut the saw off at that time, wait for the saw to come to a complete stop, then you can remove any pieces of scrap that may remain. That is the protocol when using a short stock. When using a long one, same exact thing, but I'm going to have the saw running. Once again, it's not going to hurt anyone. I can pick the stock up, get it in position, and cut. As you see here, I have the piece of sheet good. Why we brought this out, for cutting sheet good, we want to make sure that we have rotated this fence over. And once again, you can cut in either position with the fence, but we definitely want to make sure it's in the upright or vertical position when cutting sheets, any type of sheet good. Again, there has tendency to have warpage or a slight bow to this. This is going to allow us to have a more of a shoulder to keep the stock against. We also want to make sure we raise the stock a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch, probably more like 1/4 of an inch out of our stock when cutting sheet good, because of the fact that there might be some distortion among the surface of the board. Once again, we want it in this vertical position. Anytime I'm cutting narrow stock, I drop the fence down into the flat position. Because this gives me more room for my hand with the push stick, keeping me further away. It's not intruding on the space that I have there to make the cut. If we are cutting anytime in our shops, this is here at Sacramento High School, anytime here at our shops and we're cutting narrow stock, we're going to make sure we have a helper on the outside, on the out feed table of the table saw here. And what their responsibility is, once it exits the table, they're going to help hold this against the fence to keep it from leaking off the fence. If you're cutting that by yourself, you can use what is called a feather board. Once Once again, based on all the cuts and different cuts that we make, we keep the motherboard out of the way because we have so many extra students that are always waiting in line. They easily can help you with cutting that narrow stock, and then you can get help at a later time as well. I'm going to perform an actual cut this time. Once again, I'm going down to 4 inches. Pushing the lockdown pin in, or lockdown handle in for the lockdown fence. I'm going to remove this material from my fence. Get my push stick in the proper location. Jointed edges up. Already checked the blade height. Only my board will fit underneath the blade guard. Jointed edges up. I'm now going to make one cut with a longer stock. Those were both rip cuts made on the table saw. As you just could see when I was making this cut, at no time did I ever let the board go. I always had my hands in contact with it. When I was transitioning to get the push stick, I always made sure I had contact with the board, keeping my forward progress into the blade. Once again, we never want to let go of that. Obviously, the blade is causing a force back at us while we're pushing this through, so we need to make sure we have our hands in contact with the board at all times. We also, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, we have to make sure we have a jointed edge anytime we're using the table saw. That is because we're always using the fence or the miter gauge when cutting. We cannot do a freehand cutting process on the table saw. The only saws in the shop that we can do freehand cutting with are the bandsaw and the scroll saw. So, now to utilize the miter gauge. If we're going to use the miter gauge, in many instances you'll have to remove the blade guard. Again, if we're using the miter gauge, we cannot use it as a cross-cut process. We're cross-cutting this piece. I cannot use it in conjunction with the fence. I cannot use them both at the same time. I can, however, use the fence as a stop block if I would like, but I'm going to use a superficial spacer in doing so. So if this is the stop block that I set, I will set that superficial board there as my stop block. Once I start my cutting process, I'm going to remove that superficial board so I am not in contact with the fence while using the miter gauge, and then I can proceed to make my cross cut. Safety margin is still 4 inches on this.